で本日は南座宗教文化研究所の、公開講演会という形で、現在日本に一時帰国されている有坂先生にご講演いただきます。急に決まった企画でして、南座の先生に周知する時間はなかったんですが、本日お集まりいただきました先生方ありがとうございます。活発な議論になることを期待しております。
So, thank you, Professor Watanabe. We can start. I think it's not necessary that I introduce Professor Arisaka. Everyone received an email with all the details. And I prefer to use all the time to hear the talk and to discuss together with Professor Arisaka.
So thank you so much for the invitation, and also sorry that it was a rather quick notice, but I'm very happy to be here. So the history of philosophies in a global perspective, and this is a project I am a part of at the University of Hildesheim in Germany. It's a 5-year project. Okay, I'll start introducing the project later on in more detail. But what I wanted to discuss in this short presentation is the outline. First, I wanted to talk about the historiographies of the histories of philosophies. History of philosophy is not a given. It is a narrative that has been established over centuries, right? So the histories of philosophies themselves have a history. And specifically, I wanted to look at the process from the 18th and 19th centuries during this period in European philosophy. And because that is the time, what we call a history of philosophy, which is a Western history of philosophy, that has been established. So, and since then, we live in historical period, in the philosophical period, where when we say history of philosophy, we mean a Western history of philosophy from the Greeks to the medieval times and the modern period, and then 17th, 18th, and 19th century European philosophy and 20th century philosophy, this whole sequence that we know as a history of philosophy. So I want to briefly sort of run through this creation of what we call philosophy, which is basically a history of Western philosophy. And introduce this project of ours because I wanted to talk about what philosophy might look like in the future. Because it could be that this traditional notion of the history of philosophy as Western history of philosophy is no longer it holds. So first, the historiographies of the histories of philosophies. Some methodological considerations include, as I said, the histories of philosophies have histories themselves that we can look at. We can do it comparatively, genealogically, and we can also do it hermeneutically. And in this process, we learn, and by we learn, we mean we have done a lot of bibliographical research as well as look at the text and who says what in what way, that kind of a thing. So in this process of interpretations, transmissions, and possible translations are very important in this process. Sort of naturally or deliberately, the selections and exclusions occur. Certain lines of work become standard and they become canonical, and others become basically forgotten or deliberately put on the side. Yeah? And after 3 generations, these books will not be referred to anymore. So in this, the processes have much to do with the actual people who are involved, the philosophers, who actually participate in this process through conversations, salons, research situations, and academic as well as otherwise context. It's a process of interaction, how some books become canonical in this process. So the process are not just philosophical, but it is political and cultural, linguistic, geographical, and even personal or accidental. A lot has to do with something like identity politics of the time. Right? So these things have always happened. So we treat the result of this whole process as if that's a product of some natural canonical process, but it has not been. So it is to sort of genealogically approach this whole process in order to see how we have the current history of philosophy as we know it. This is from, this book, Elmar Holtenstein's Philosophie Atlas, The Place and Ways of Thought, 2004. It's like an atlas book. If you are a map fan, as I am, I love maps. It traces in amazing detail what kind of thoughts traveled in what direction basically from before the Greeks. And so long as one can see, the thoughts do travel. And in this process, the translations occur or not occur, right? So what goes through this process, it takes place over several hundred years or longer, or sometimes shorter, but it is a global process. Philosophy in the 18th century, if we look at the manuscripts, for instance, from Michael Hildesheim, 1750 to 1784. So that's 18th century books that we have looked at. For instance, Guide to the Knowledge of the Selected Literature in All Areas of Philosophy, a German book. We see that philosophies of Egypt, Caldean, this is like a Babylonian, Persian, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, and Phoenician philosophies are in there. It is amazing that they were all there. Sometimes not positively, so just all there doesn't mean that it's positively valued, but at least discussed. Elias Schmeisser's book, also from the same period, that's called History of Philosophy. That's one of the early history of what they call the history of philosophy. Jewish, Caldean, again, Persian, Arabic, Chinese, Indian, Phoenician, Greek, and also Wisdom of the Turks. They were all there. And Ortloff, that's also late 18th century, 1798. Again, the collection is, so at the time it was a sort of common list of Hebrew philosophies, Chaldean philosophy, Persian, Arabic, Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, and Phoenician philosophies were legitimately included in the history of philosophy discussions. And nowadays, some of these are completely gone. If you refer to Rolf Elberfeld's book, we also have English as well as German versions of this discussion. The bibliography is there. I'll make it also available. Even in English, the list previously was in German, but even in English, the same period, the inclusions were pretty much the same, the collection of philosophies that they have discussed. And one amazing literature, 1755, I think, in Latin, there is a book of Mexican philosophy, history of a Mexican philosophy, written in Latin in 1755. So back then, philosophy was diverse. It was diverse. So now we're trying to catch up and make philosophy diverse, but it actually was. And from this period until now, something happened that it became undiverse and totally Eurocentric. So what happened in the 19th century, there were several factors that led to, as far as we can tell, the narrowing down of the history of philosophy to this conception. And this was the time when they were writing and figuring out what does philosophy mean, history of philosophy mean, right? And then many discussions happened, but for instance, one of the participants in this process, Friedrich Überweg, the so-called philosophy of the Orientals lacked the tendency to strict reasoning and therefore the scientific character. What is found in them of philosophical content is so completely merged with the religious views that the discussions may be left to the history of religion. In addition, even with the solid researchers of current times, our knowledge of ancient Oriental thought, especially with the Egyptians, is still far too incomplete and unsubstantiated for a coherent presentation free of arbitrary presuppositions. So it might be appropriate to abandon the so-called Oriental philosophy in this outline. they were mostly German-speaking philosophers and Latin. They wrote in Latin and German. They discussed, and in this process, they had to decide what stays in philosophy and what gets to the other departments. The influential idea was that a scientific thought had to be scientific. And by that, they meant reason and rationality, objectivity, universality, and the scientific method that had to be followed, and philosophy would also become one of those disciplines. So that was the imagination of the German philosophers at the time. So that meant then the exclusion of religious philosophies, medieval philosophy, religious philosophies, Christian philosophies, as well as non-European forms of thought. They were not even, by then they were not called philosophy, but sort of the traditions, say. This was a time also, a period of rapid European expansion. And colonialism and imperialist expansions all over Africa and Asia was happening at the time. And these, the sort of Eurocentric defense of this whole process included also sort of openly racist discourses, which is clearly to be seen in well-known philosophical figures, Hume, Kant, Hegel, Locke. Now we know all these people who wrote about Africa and China and so on. So this was also a period of colonial forms of European racism. And also this, to view history as a temporal sequence of progress. So there's this history, it is a time flow from past to the present to the future, and that has to do with the notion of progress. So something has to progress in the direction of European modernity and civilization and rationalization and scientific advancement. So, but that was a particular post-Enlightenment way of capturing history and development in history. And in this historical narrative of Hegel's, for instance, in his Wissenschaft, in his sciences, you can clearly see this developmental idea culminating in European civilization as the most advanced form. And the Chinese people can imitate, but they're not real. Africa, just forget about it. I mean, that's kind of an amazing Hegelian discourse, was taken for granted, justified, taken to be real. Yeah? At the same time, it was also happening through this whole discussion and establishment of university departments. That's where things got eliminated. Philosophy departments had to be established, and it had to be who comes in and what kind of discussions are allowed and what gets out. And that is, the discussion over 20, 30 years, 40 years. Most of the Indian and Buddhist philosophies went to philology, so Indology, Buddhologies. On theology, actually the most sort of active debate happened between theology and philosophy. What goes in theology, what goes in philosophy? So Rolf Elberfeld has a much more detailed discussion of this particular period and debate, how philosophy became philosophy and not religious philosophy or theological philosophy. And anthropology and culture. So all these other departments had to also be established, and who goes there and who remains in philosophy. That was a contentious discussion. And the result is philosophy became almost like what we know it is today, the history of philosophy as beginning from the Greeks. That means what happened before the Greeks in Egypt and Arabic languages, they were sort of eliminated. And then our common narrative of what got translated and became medieval philosophy and how it became the modern thought and became the period of modernity and rational philosophies and the rest as we know it. And if you look at this time period, the colonial empire of the Western world of Africa and Asia and the rest, it was not sort of like an equal world, right? So what's called the South, what we now call the South, they are under this colonial siege by Europe. And in this period, now we have the category of Western philosophy. We also did some research on the term, right? The Western philosophy. When did that appear and what? The earliest example we can see, 1862, that was in Japan, among the Japanese philosophers. They used the term Western philosophy for the first time, as far as we can tell. 1923, that appeared for the first time in Chinese. 1945, that was Bertrand Russell's famous book, The History of Western Philosophy. So actually, that sort of also helped cement this notion of history of Western philosophy as we know it. The Russell's book was very influential in English. It appeared in Korean for the first time in 1955. 1974, Indonesian, they already used this term Western philosophy. And around the same time, also in Arabic, because Russell's book was translated into Arabic in 1977. And so the notion of Western philosophy became common in Arabic-speaking philosophical world. In Western languages, German, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, they just simply conflated philosophy with Western European philosophy from the Greeks. They took over this tradition. And for them, philosophy meant this tradition. Russian was interesting. They were sort of unique. Many books on the history of philosophy were translated from German, and they took over this notion of Western philosophy, but they didn't equate that with philosophy. They just called it Western philosophy, sort of like a regional philosophy in the West. So the universalizing effect of Western philosophy as a philosophy did not happen in the Russian language. So this is where we are, 20th century and 21st century. Philosophy has established itself rather as Eurocentric, as we commonly refer to, and it is a colonial project still, to the extent that we eliminated all the other philosophies and claim that it has always been this way and that it's the best form of philosophy. Racist traditions have never been really addressed within our history. That must be done if we are going to be serious about the history of philosophy. And white supremacist, I mean, that's a strong word, a term that we use today, but in the sense that they specifically talked about the white European race in order to talk about the non-European races. So it is a part of the language and ways of thinking that we still inherit. And women also, we know, they were not part of this history. And in order for the philosophy to be respected or counted as real philosophy, it had to be in one of these Western languages, German, French, Spanish. Spanish is sort of like the second order Western language. And Spanish is a very interesting linguistic research field because it is a colonial language. And there's a whole bunch of anti-colonial philosophy and literature done in Spanish, which is also a colonial language, but used otherwise. Yeah. And it's pretends to be scientific, but as a humanities discipline with a lot of history, I mean, it is sort of pseudo-scientific, right? I mean, a very small part of philosophy is actually scientific. You can take logic, you can take philosophy of mathematics, you can take some aspects of philosophy of science, but the philosophy as a whole, you don't want to say that is like natural sciences. It isn't. So if we look at histories of philosophies in other regions of the world and in non-European languages, it is clear that they have a completely different approach to thinking through a histories of philosophy. So in the West, in Europe and in the United States, maybe to some extent in Japan too, the rest of the world philosophy, it is not considered a legitimate part of philosophy, or some sort of a strange feel about, yeah, but that's not real philosophy. Well, that's religion. Well, that's Eastern thought. Well, that's not, it's not considered part of philosophy, but that's only because we discuss in English or in German or French or in Spanish or any of these Western languages what philosophy means. And so it's like our internal language produces this effect. But if you switch the language, if you are Russian speaking, if you are Chinese speaking, if you are any of the other Arabic speaking, the history of philosophy looks quite different. But since we don't have access to these languages, we are sort of insular. Japan is a kind of a westernized philosophy place, right? So that sort of like an Asian exception to this scene. Yeah. And what's tricky is the critiques that are nowadays produced against the Eurocentrism of philosophy, since they are parasitic on this Eurocentric framework, are they still indirectly Eurocentric? That is our worry, right? So you do comparative and non-European philosophies, but the reference point still remains this traditional, the history of Western philosophy, and then you compare other thoughts, but the reference still remains in our traditional framework, right? So one could say that it's opening up the edges, but the fundamental paradigm still remains. And similarly to post-colonial and decolonial critiques, the methodologies one uses, you have to rely on Foucault, Marx, and these are critical methods, right, which are fundamentally comes out of this Western tradition. So this very idea of critique, perhaps that is also parasitic on the Eurocentric tradition. Not everything in the European tradition is bad, right? I mean, there's a lot of good things in it too. I mean, Enlightenment brought a whole lot of good things, and one of them is the idea of a critique. Yeah, so it is not to dismiss, but to notice. Okay, the reference point and the methodological questions must be kept in mind. That where are the reference points? Yeah? And we produce these sort of identity-based variations today, like African American, or Africana, Asian American, Latin American, but they too are part of this sort of American discourse, right? So that it has to do with rather American way of imagining identities, and we export them and import them. We now talk about Africana philosophy. We don't have any other, currently we don't have any other ways of doing this in English or in Western languages. If you go to other parts of the globe, they discuss it differently. In Spanish, for instance, as I said, they have a very different discussion going on in Latin American critique, right? And then feminism, gender studies, LGBTQ, these are also attempts to diversify, but also heavily dependent on the Western modes of discourse, identity formation, and critique, similarly to disability studies and so on. World philosophies is also an attempt, fairly old attempt, turn of the century. Since then, they have discussed what's called global philosophy or the world philosophies. And the earliest attempt was by Wilhelm Wundt, 1909. That's pretty early to talk about world philosophy. Nowadays, we have over 30 books in English, and German, all these books that specifically talk about world philosophies. So that's a rough outline. I mean, that's what we have been doing for the last 5 years. Our project in Hildesheim, more specifically to introduce our project, it is funded by the German Research Foundation. That's where our money comes from. And what we do is under the development of an open source web database. And it's a huge bibliographical database on the histories of philosophies written in different languages. We have currently 26 languages: Ancient Greek, Arabic, Chinese, English, French, German, Hebrew, Indonesian, Italian, Japanese, Latin, Korean, Persian, Polish, Portuguese, Russian, Sanskrit, Swedish, Spanish, Tibetan, Turkish, Ukrainian, Afrikaans, Icelandic, and Georgian. And we, our team has competence in many of these languages, but the languages that we don't know about, we have native speakers who are philosophers who are interested in this project, so we outsource them. We asked them to produce this database, which I will show you in a minute, and then they, after a few months, they give us the list, we check, and we put it up on our website. So from this kind of work, we have now come to understand philosophy as European history of philosophy, the normal conception of Western philosophy or philosophy. That's a particular post-19th century narrative in European languages, English and also Japanese. Yeah. And history of philosophies through these bibliographical references, if we look at them, which I will show you in a minute, that looks very different. They might have a Western philosophy category, but it's also under Western philosophy. It's regionalized, right? So that it's not the whole history of philosophy. Yeah. And in our project, we also look at what are the exclusionary mechanisms. Yeah? So how do philosophy exclude certain discourses? And that's how we look at exclusion of non-European women, or European women too, but especially non-European women. Race discourse, we look at histories of racism, and we look at decolonial philosophies because they do a lot of research in this area. And oral traditions we also include, because they have practically no chance. And by this, we have come to alter the presuppositions about what must be counted as philosophy. Yeah? Because that too must be, adjusted and altered, because we realize our sense of what philosophy must be is quite recent and quite narrow. We have publications, and we also have conferences, research meetings, cooperations, and so that's what we have been doing. As I said, our director is Rolf Elberfeld, whom some of you might know very well, and all of our books are open source. So from our website, all these books are downloadable and readable. Philosophy in einer globalisierten Welt, in a global world, decolonial Philosophien. As the book in the middle shows, we are changing our approach to philosophy as an activity, not as a noun, philosophy as a what. But what does it mean to do philosophy? Philosophically think. So it is an active approach to thinking about philosophy. Our co-director, Anke Granes, she is a specialist in Africa, and her recent book on the left, unfortunately, it's still only in German, and it's a huge book a research book on the histories of philosophies in Africa. That's a pretty amazing book. So anyway, I'd like to, if possible, go online so I can sort of ditz around in the website. And I don't know how that shows up in Zoom.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah,
Share the screen.
Share the screen.
yeah. And then we just have to do this.
Should be
We already have the, どこだっけそれか。ね、それじゃない。それはパワーポイント。Yeah.
Can you check the desktop? I think it makes things easier.
Desktop. Because we already have the website up.
Yeah, it was in Safari too. Yeah, it launched. What's the one I want?
どこだっけ
I don't know why it won't give me the option.
Go to the desktop and open it. Yeah, I think, yeah.
Oh, there it is. This is where I want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I should be sharing. Okay.
見えますか大丈夫
You have to check on your computer, whatever, if you don't know. This thing is quite small, I think. It's very small.
The letters there.
Yes.
But that's okay. チャットはいいですか
何も書いてないので多分大丈夫かな。
これどうやったらこの下に行くのそうか。メインページはこうやっていろんな数種類の言語でこのプロジェクトは何をやってるかってことが出ています。それがプロジェクト description in many languages. Did I just speak Japanese? Sorry. What I want to show you is the following. It's where we have the histories of philosophies in different languages. That's where these bibliographical collection is about. Let's look at Chinese, for instance. We have the list from 1600s onward, and if you look at the 20th century history, African philosophy, if you click on this African philosophy, that would be a Chinese African philosophy written in Chinese that has something to do with the history of. Yeah, so from 2000, African philosophy is a new field, so it is relatively new. How do I go back? So up there. Does that work?
Yeah.
I'm not used to Mac. And then in Chinese language, you can also look at, for instance, I don't know, 17th and 18th century Enlightenment philosophy, for instance. That will be a discussion of Western philosophies. And if you look at, well, French, German, Hebrew, I mean, these are sort of English languages. They are sort of English, for instance, since we're all English speakers. Our bibliography goes back to 16th century. And then sometimes for old material, you can take a look at table of contents, but also internet source, and sometimes the whole manuscript is there. So it is, maybe it doesn't load. Okay, so anyway, so you can do quite a bit of research from our website. It is for research purposes. If you want to look at different kinds of bibliographies, what is out there. And we also have ancient languages such as Sanskrit. And we have included very old material so far as we can find them. And they are not like philosophy in the way we understand them, but they are doxographies. And they talk about previous teachers and thought, and they order in a historical sequence. And so we included them in the history of philosophy, what we call the history of philosophy, but some of these resources are very old. So the conception of what we think of, sort of like a temporal sequence of thought traditions, it has been in many, many, many languages. Turkish is also an old language. And we have resources also from old times, 19th century, or maybe the list is from 19th century. So that would be, in Turkish, they write about Chinese philosophy from the 1930s, for instance. These books are there. D.T. Suzuki, for instance, is translated into Turkish. Yeah. So we then find out what's been translated in which languages. And Japanese is one of the most extensive lists. There are over 1,500 entries, and that is what we have a book that we have produced it in a book form. So I brought it, so you guys have the entire 1,500 entries in a printed out form, so you can take a look. And so these are sort of collections in different languages that you can look at in a website. And apart from histories of philosophies in different languages, we also collected bibliographies on the global histories of philosophies in different languages. So far we have Arabic, Chinese, German, yeah, okay. So that would be the list of, well, we'll look at English again. From 1963, that was the earliest example. And that would be the kind of books in English. This is an English list that we are looking at, where they have a conception of global or world philosophy and so on and so forth. Some of these well-known ones included this Elliot Deutsch's Introduction to World Philosophies, or Ninian Smart, World Philosophies. These are sort of well-known books, right, that we all know. And there's like sort of explosion of them nowadays. Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. That's a podcast that is excellent if you want to go through. It's an amazing list of inclusion of non-Western thought and philosophies. And basically people go through this list and they sometimes say that, okay, this information is missing. So we look at it and we update our website. And if any of you are native speakers who do philosophy, you don't even have to be a native speaker, but you have an interest in going through this database work, we pay €5 per entry to come up with this list. So our project is ending in March, so we don't have a lot of time. But if you are interested in doing any of these linguistic research of the languages we don't have, please contact us. We are always looking for people who are competent in doing this kind of research. Our team. Currently, we work with, that's our team. Director Rolf Elberfeld, Manuel Espinosa is from Chile, but he's done his research in Macau. Namita Herzl, she does all of the German languages, historical research on women, non-Western women, and also historical research in German. Francisca Greco, she does Spanish, Italian, and French. Yours truly, who does Japanese and American and diversity issues and so on and so forth. Anke Granes is, as I mentioned, the co-director and specialist in African thought, feminism, and Lara Hofner is Caribbean thought, Spanish, and also decolonial philosophies. It's a great team. Very competent people with different linguistic background. We also had in the previous years somebody who's a native Chinese speaking person, and also others who could participate with another language. So that is our publication, as I said. Holmes Verlag that we use is everything is open access. If you just click on them, you can read all these books. And if it's not from our bonus phylact, then it's not downloadable. So we have a Histories of Philosophy and Thought in Korean language. That's one of our new ones. That's all in Korean. It's also open access if you're interested in this kind of a bibliographical list in Korean. And that is the Japanese one. That's also open access. You can look at all of the books that is, not the books themselves, but the bibliographical information. Some of them are online, if we have access to them. So that is our publications. So the theoretical and methodological considerations that might come out of this kind of a research is, as I said, the reconsideration of what philosophy means. So academic philosophy as a subject is one thing, but philosophizing as human activities is another, right? And if you globalize this kind of philosophy in a global context, we do necessarily move from a narrow academic self-conception of philosophy to a much more inclusive philosophizing as a human activity. And then look at what kind of philosophies have been recorded. And if we assume that there was such a thing as philosophy in other cultures as well, then take into account that our concept of philosophy, with its emphasis on universality or the strict scientific method and so on, is only a regional variety, which is a European one. Then the question arises as to what we are actually looking for when we are interested in philosophy in other cultures, right? So we tend to beg the question. We always say, well, that's not real philosophy. And then we exclude them and never leaving our own conception, right? So we're trying to change this particular approach. So gathering of bibliographical material in other languages on the history of philosophy, we don't enforce our conception of history of philosophy. We go to the languages and then look at, in this particular language, how do they discuss philosophy and history of philosophy, and then collected them, and then reflect on, what can that mean, right? So our methodology was such that we work as much as possible without presuppositions about what philosophy means. And then we look at the languages, and within the languages sort of find out how they go about talking about history or philosophy in general, yeah? So, and then we notice our periodizations themselves are completely Western and European, and yeah? So if you go to China, the Chinese language list, the periodizations are by these dynasties, right? And it's not, you can't apply this ancient to the medieval or the modern or centuries list. So we had to create our list in other ways so it's like a dynasty based. And so geographically too, we had in our database, we do in Chinese language Western philosophy, and it just sort of broke down too, because these regional conceptions are also dependent on our ways of doing it. And Russian regional histories of philosophies, for instance, they include all kinds of Titanic philosophy. These are regions that we don't know what to call them. Western? They're not Western. Are they Russian? Well, they are formerly Russian. So we just name them the way they name it, and then stick there. But sort of these our database creation themselves forced us to rethink our own presuppositions about periodizations, regionalizations, and our conceptions of what belongs and what doesn't belong, and that sort of thing. Arabic versus Islam. I mean, many Islamic literature from Indonesia, for instance, they are not Arabic, but Islamic. Yeah? They have more to, content-wise, I mean, Indonesian philosophical literature that has more in common with Asian kind of discussions, but they are not Asian, but they are Indonesian. And Arabic also, sort of Eastern Arabic, Western Arabic, I mean, there's a huge variety of approaches. And as I said, interesting is the Spanish language. That's very interesting because of this colonial history that's reflected in the list. But all in all, women are universally excluded. So if anything is universal, it's the women exclusion of women in philosophy. There's no history of philosophies that we looked at that didn't exclude women. So there you have the universality of our philosophy, unfortunately. So that's a database discussion. I have this just in case that I didn't have an access to the online. So this is this 1755 entry of Mexican philosophy. So in Japan, that's the breakup of Japan, over 1,500 entries, 688 entries on regions and nations, regional teachings, and so on. These are some of the conferences we've had. We just had our the status of oral traditions in the history of philosophy. That was very interesting. Specialists from African, Native American, Latin American, and Maori, and how they methodologically approach the topic of philosophy, how philosophy is not only written, right? When philosophy not only written, I mean, there's a lot of discussions about if it's not written, what do you call a philosophy? I mean, there's actions, there's rituals, there's interpersonal communications that is philosophy. How they do it is philosophy making. Yeah? We've also had series of talks on women in the history of philosophy, women in the histories of non-Western philosophy, non-canonical women, and the other regions. And then last year we had a huge conference on humanities, eurocentrism critique. That's this kind of discussion of critique. And as I mentioned, some of these resources and critiques. Sorry. So in the near and distant future, philosophy is already no longer Western. Now we do a lot of diversity work in the United States that's sort of seeping out in other parts of the world. And if the political conditions allow it, yeah, this is a quote from Rolf Elberfeld, yeah, in the near and distant future, if the political conditions allow it, I am convinced that the practicing of philosophy itself, as well as history of philosophy, would look completely different by the year 2100, which I think is true. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. That's it. So that has been the introduction of our project, the SELECT project. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, I think we can start the second part of today's talk, part of the discussion. We received a lot of questions or suggestions in the chat, basically from two people. One person is Professor O'Leary, and another person, Akshay, gave some hints, for example, about some books, Ralph Bauer book or Peter Park, Race and Philosophy.
Yes.
Mentioned Mendelssohn, I don't know in which sense. And finally, wrote that Tantra is composed by women. So interesting for our discussion. And then Professor O'Leary put a lot of questions. So I don't know if it makes sense that we go through all the, or we can simply ask Professor O'Leary to put camera and microphone on and discuss directly with Professor Arisaka. Maybe it's easier or better.
Yeah, maybe. I just wanted to say that we are in contact with Peter Park, who has written this amazing book, Race and Philosophy, and so we know about his work, and he is also one of our contact persons.
So, Professor Levy, please. But we cannot hear you. We cannot hear you.
Hello, hello.
Yes, hello. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I just gave a laundry list of the usual questions, which have been haunting this entire thing for the last 200 years, really, but since the Oriental Renaissance.
Yes.
So I don't claim to have any particular new insight. Just running through the usual questions,
The presence of Asia had been at least in German-speaking philosophy. It's from the time of Leibniz. There was a lot of literature from Chinese and
right.
also Schopenhauer. There's a reference. Yeah, definitely that had been a part of this a thought. However, that is only discussed among people who do Asian philosophy, but not a part of the. It had not been part of the discussion in the history of philosophy, but after the 19th century. But if you look at the 18th century material, there is quite a bit. And also not in a derogatory manner as in the 19th century, post-19th century material, but actually as an interesting source of an insight. So,
but don't you think Karl Jaspers, for example,
yeah,
he's an important philosopher, and he studies as best he can because he didn't know the languages, but he studies Nagarjuna and
yeah. So there had been what we call Western philosophy, especially German-speaking philosophers who had engaged themselves quite extensively with Asian thought. Confucianism was introduced very early as one of the important moral philosophies. So it's possible.
Sorry to interrupt. What about the Boston Brahmins? The study of Oriental thinking in Boston. I don't know, Josiah Royce, for example, and T.S. Eliot was a student of those, and he, even though he wasn't, well, he was a philosopher, but he devoted his life to literature. He taught an awful lot about Buddhism from a philosophical angle, the self, the status of the self, for example. These kind of things do percolate in the West in many ways, It might not be I think continental philosophy is much more open than analytical philosophy.
I think it will be very fruitful to make sort of like an alternative history of philosophy focused on these discussions, right? These German-speaking or American philosophers' engagement with other parts of the world. And that's at least a good project, I think. And to produce an alternative account. But thank you very much.
And I mean, I'd like to underline one thing, that anthropology, the study, for example, of Indian philosophers, there's a famous book whose name eludes me at the moment about the Indian way of thinking, the American Indian way of thinking. And these are books that are not categorized in the library under the heading of philosophy, but of anthropology, religious studies. But nonetheless, philosophers do take an interest in those books, and they do percolate. I mean, it's not a rigid. I mean, maybe academic disciplines and syllabuses look rigid, but philosophers are just as interested as anyone else, and perhaps more interested than most other ways of thinking. I mean, Heidegger is often categorized as a Eurocentric thinker, but of course he wasn't. He was very interested in China and Japan and in dialogue with sources, even trying to learn Chinese,
and also engaged himself with a Japanese person on the way the language.
Okay, before to go on with Professor O'Leary, there are here and also online people who want to say something about the points that were now spoken. So Akshay, you raise your hand if you want to put your question.
Yes, can I speak?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Dankeschön. I mean, really fantastic.
Thank you.
So the problem which I've seen in German philosophy is they have an active, like I can use the word agenda to remove Jewish sources from German thinking. This research has come out only very recently written by Holocaust researchers, right from Kant to Hegel, and later it started from theology. There was a project to remove Hebrew Bible from Protestant Bible. Then this spilled over to philology and eventually to racial thinking, the whole Aryan and Semitic. So when we say German philosophy, we should first acknowledge the fact that Germans are trying to use Jewish resources, but not acknowledging them and eventually erasing them after a point. And with this in mind, Germans studied either Sanskrit or China or like Japan, because they wanted to trace a non-Hebrew past for Germany, saying that we did not come from Israel, but we came from like Tibet, India, Caucasian, on all that. So when we say German philosophy, first we have to like understand what really is German philosophy, and that has a major part to do with Germans' like intention or agenda to remove Jewish sources. So eventually this gets applied to other philosophies. So for example, in Europe, they study Sanskrit. They only study the abstract part of the Sanskrit. They don't study the yoga part of Sanskrit. And they say ritual is like, all these are mythology. So they break up a Sanskrit text into different parts. Even when they see, even these days, when researchers go to native traditions, say in Amazon or North American native communities, they don't look at the entire living tradition. They only want to break up everything. This is logic, this is mythology. I think this is not addressed in your project. That's my observation.
That was a comment, not specifically a question. Yeah. But yeah, thank you so much for your comment on the German academic milieu at the time. It's true. There's a fairly complicated stories about the exclusions of the Jewish philosophy as well as the Christian thought, and the conversation between the Protestant and the Catholic in Germany at the time. And all these things contributed to the creation of the list of the remaining list after everything else had been excluded. And that's the sort of the Enlightenment German philosophers that remained. But before this whole process was, really before the creation really of the history of philosophy as a discipline, as a subcategory of philosophy, right? So we were trying to deal with this creation of the historiography. So it was sort of in the making. And that alone is, I think, a very interesting subject of research. Yeah? And sort of historically speaking, this whole 18th to the 19th century philosophy making in Latin and German-speaking worlds. Maybe also an anthropological, sort of academic anthropological study, because it had a lot to do with who talked to whom and who liked whom, and these things also coming. We all know we're academics. We exclude people we don't like. So, I mean, it's no different at the time. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. But thank you very much.
Then I think, Jimmy, you wanted to put a question?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, there's another mic, yeah.
Yeah, first of all, I think this is an amazing project. For the last 25 years or so, many of us have been talking around the subject, and our arguments have been kind of feeling or intuition, or maybe anecdotal. But this is an attempt to put together the sources and gather the data and sort it out and rephrase the questions from the way we've been asking them from a very narrow perspective. I think this is an astonishing project, and it can go so many different directions. Of course, it also brings back the questions that need to be reformulated. For example, what is philosophy? Now, just to make a very simple point, when the missionaries spoke of Mexican philosophy and wrote a book about Mexican philosophy, they're talking about things that overlap with our concept of philosophy. Mm-hmm. There certainly was no word for philosophy in Nahuatl. Mm-hmm. This was something that they were concerned with. So some of these philosophies in the past were proto-philosophies, or what we call primitive philosophies. Your project requires that we rethink that whole thing. We find different words to define philosophy. And the question is how you're going to do it. Is it a method of thinking? Are the scope of the questions? Or does it have to do with whether it's universal or particular? At some point, you have to define the hermeneutical net that you're casting to gather in the data of what's going to be known as philosophy.
Right.
And that also then brings up the question of what we're going to exclude from philosophy. So philosophy is the love of wisdom. But what happens when you get to a sophisticated hatred of wisdom? What happens when you get to a racially discriminatory philosophy, or a philosophy of Nazism or fascism?
Oh yeah, that's
or of a philosophy of economic capitalism and so forth. The word philosophy is used already in two very different senses, professionally, academically, and then just as a way of thinking, a way of life. And then without some kind of a norm or a standard, even if it's vague at first, culled from all this data you have, without some kind of a norm, myths and cosmological stories and religious doctrine, which are all included in some of the history of philosophies, they must be, otherwise you wouldn't have Africa and Chaldea and the ancient Phoenicians and so forth, and none of whom had this word philosophy. Now, without some sort of a norm, we won't be able to sift through these things. Right. Now, I don't say it's important that we keep philosophy and religion separate, or philosophy and cosmology and myths, that we keep them separate. But you have to decide at some point, is philosophy going to be a big concept, sort of the biggest universal or human thought? And if so, what is going to be excluded from it? It can't be all inclusive.
Right.
But we, don't want to leave the women out, but there are things that we may want to leave out, Yes.
That was directed is Rolf Elberfeld's intuition. He wanted to find out what's out there before we start talking about what's the philosophy, the history of philosophy in other parts of the world. We have no sources.
Yeah.
So first we had to gather these information. So we did. And then after 3 years, we can start analyzing the things. And in the process, just the Japanese collection, I was involved in the Japanese collection. I mean, sort of hours of going through this data in this national library, right? And then sometimes in the title, there's a word philosophy, but if you look at the table of contents, they only talk about art, for instance, right? And then it becomes a discussion at the next meeting. Here's this philosophy book, but they only talk about art. Do we want that on our list, or do we not want it on our list? So it's actually a tedious process of looking at exactly what should we include, exclude, and it's for the list, it was almost a judgment. We have to actually look at things. And we didn't include a calendar of growing corn, for instance, in the Aztec list, right? But we included the cosmologies, for instance, because there's all these different things. If you look at oral traditions, likewise, some rituals are purely to do with doing certain very specific cultural things, and they are not what we think of as philosophy in the sense of something to do with goodness or society or reality or persons, or so it's methodological as well as topic. Yeah, and we did it as bright as possible. And whether they actually use the term, if not philosophy, something equivalent to philosophy to describe their own activities. Yeah, so the list is not perfect, but it was a lot of judgment call, and every time we had something like that, we discussed, yeah, but boy, what about this and what about this? And then, for instance, podcasts and mangas and animes, and so these are sort of new forms nowadays, right? I mean, if it's an anime form, is Evangelion? I mean, we want to call it philosophy? Do we want to include it? Do we want to, yeah? So the story is not at the end because of the form and as a social media. I mean, do we want to include all philosophical discussions in social media as legitimate philosophy, or is that just something else, right? It's so these are sort of new problems that we face just as much as analyzing the old material, right? And yeah, I mean, the philosophy of the Nazi period, we also discussed a great deal about what to do with this material, this bit. I don't think we have the final answer. We might have to actually have a separate clickable thing and have a collection that listed with a careful analysis of that material. So yeah, these are sort of, you pointed out all these difficulties we have and have faced and not yet solved. We still have to march. Yeah, the list is still.
What about the notion of dialogue? You never mentioned the word dialogue.
Yeah. The dialogue as I mean, dialogues and conversations are great philosophical forms, right? But usually it doesn't come up in philosophy as written. In oral traditions conference, there were a lot of discussions about is orality itself, when the oral thought that's written as philosophy, that's different from oral communication in itself, right, as activity.
I don't mean oral, sorry, I don't mean oral dialogue. I mean things like dialogues between philosophy and literature, which is a vast, vast world. Or dialogues between philosophy and religion, or philosophy and theology, or philosophy and science.
Yeah, and then we had to have a sort of like we had to draw a line, right? We couldn't include everything. So we focused on the history of. So if it was the history of the philosophy of religion, most likely we have that in our list. The history of the philosophy of science, history of the philosophy of history, the history of. So I mean, for this particular bibliography list, we wanted to do a history of, right? So it's a history list. It's not philosophy in general. So if it was not a historical narrative of the particular subject, it didn't make the cut, so to speak. So sometimes, under the history of philosophy, they only discuss Kant, for instance. Then it's a book on Kant. It's not a history of philosophy. Yeah, so those are the things that we used to decide.
But in the these world congresses of philosophy, which happen every 5 years, there was one in Beijing and there's one coming up in Rome. Next year.
We're a big part of it.
But they are oriented towards dialogue. I mean, dialogue is a key word. It's not just incidental. It's the whole idea is that since there is this vast pluralism of ways of thinking, then the best thing is to respect the differences, but to engage in dialogue rather than try to amalgamate them into some mishmash, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's how we have had a series of, we invite people in and we discuss, and we keep in contact. And so we have actually sort of a network of people who work in this kind of thing. And we will also be in Rome.
Next, Felipe.
Hi,
Felipe, if you can enter in the video so that people can see.
Yeah, it was so comfortable sitting there.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you. So thank you. Actually, yeah, I had quite a few comments as well. So I'm trying to make it as short or as simple as possible. First, it just made me think something when you're talking about what should we do with the philosophy of, for example, fascism or the Nazi period, for example. And I see that we are having a very similar discussion nowadays in South America with all the dictatorships that we had around there in the 20th century. And even, for example, Brazil, we just got rid of Bolsonaro last year, right? And all these non-democratic governments down there or in South America, they always have this kind of maybe pseudo philosophical background or philosophical like basis or something. So I think that it's a very difficult question. What should we do with these bad philosophies? You know what I mean? Like what should we do? Is a bad philosophy still a philosophy? You know, like this kind of thing. So
It's certainly worth it to pick it up and discuss them, right? So that we don't want to simply get rid of them. As for a critique, we need the material.
Because every time we try to hide those guys, they find a way to come back. You know, like as always as a conspiracy theory that there was like this great philosopher in the 30s or 40s, and he was forgotten by the globalists or the media or something, right? One more thing, during your whole presentation, I was many times remembering of Noda Matao's book, the Tetsugaku no Mitsu no Dento, right? And the three traditions of philosophy, maybe should be in English, in which he deals with he says it is almost a coincidence how philosophy was born at almost the same time in Greece, in India, Nepal, and in China with Koshi, Confucius, right? Confucius, Buddha, and with Thales, right, at the same time. So I was every time remembering that as well. And the final part, I have a question to which maybe I can guess the answer, but so you were talking about how until the 18th century, the Europeans seemed, or the European philosophy historians and stuff, like they used to deal with all these that we nowadays can call world philosophies, just as philosophies, right? My question is, because we see that the Europeans during the colonial periods, for example, they had this tradition or this way of doing things, of going somewhere, turning those traditions that a group of people had, turn that into religion. Right? In order to deny that and in order to force their religion on those groups, right? So I'm wondering if something similar happened, like how did they deal when they are talking, for example, in an 18th century book or something, or 17th century or something, when they are dealing with philosophies outside of Europe, are they dealing with it as something exotic or as something that, you know, the same way that they kind of dealt with religion, or do they deal with it in the same way as we nowadays try dealing, you know what I mean?
It's a tricky question. I mean, Indian thought and Chinese thought, they were sort of accepted as philosophical enough. But no Africa, no Latin America, no Asia, except yeah, Japan, China, and India. So that the philosophers engaged a lot with Confucianism, Hindu thought, but no Latin American or Mexican tradition and no African traditions whatsoever, right? So that the landscape was a little bit different. The Egyptian thought, Arabic thought, the ancient Arabic thought, they were part of the conversation. But that all ended with this colonial endeavor, right? Then the rationality became the measure, that which was not rational. Yeah, that sort of went out there. Yeah, the list, right? But before that, many philosophical, religious philosophical thoughts were, or moral philosophy, right? So they were part of the philosophy. So normally, I mean, in the way, I mean, if you use this rationality measure, I mean, Greek philosophy would probably fall out the list. But they were also oral traditions, right? But we include them now. So
yes.
I think this makes an interesting gives an interesting possibility. Instead of establishing kind of general abstract norms for what counts as philosophy or what doesn't, because of a methodology, a way of thinking, or whether it's universal or not, whatever, whether it supports the goodness of humanity, perhaps because your whole project is based upon histories of thought. Perhaps the thing to do is to very slowly identify more pivots. For example, he just mentioned Thales, Koshi, and Buddha, whatever. Those are three pivots. And it's very easy to establish a philosophical tradition in each of them, to stretch the word philosophy. Okay, these are pivots of thought. Okay, and among them we can come up. But how about something in Islam or Africa, or Southeast Asia or Africa? Maybe there aren't any clear pivots, but if there's one or two that we can find, and that has to come from a history of thought, not from an individual thinker or a set of ideas or even a set of cosmological concerns, but from a tradition that's passed on, a tradition of thought, systematic.
To find a source of some.
And if you have those pivotal points, I mean, the Jaspers called them axial points, but perhaps there are more axes. Once we find that, even if it goes very slowly. So these histories aren't necessarily representative of a pivot. It just means some person thought, maybe I can put this into a tradition, but some of them are.
I mean, before the Greeks, right? I mean, there's this Egyptian and African traditions. They were like, it goes back way back, and I'm sure that there are things that you can identify as in these pivotal traditions, right? I mean, we just have so little research on the history of philosophy. It's just we just take it for granted, this history of philosophy. But if you open up the can of worms, right? I mean, how the Greek philosophy became the Greek philosophy that it is now is already quite a bit of contention. I mean, Rolf Elberfeld has this whole period, this ancient period. So these are sort of the things that we are interested in.
And I remember once talking to Professor Elberfeld that he was saying how these ancient cultures or civilizations, they had exchange between them, right? I remember I was attending one of his classes once in Hildesheim, and he was explaining how there were Buddhist Greek speakers before there were Japanese Buddhists, right? So, and sometimes we ignore these exchanges. We tend to think of these traditions as something isolated. But
in the Greek period, there was a lot of already Buddhist. I mean, we never talk about Greek Buddhist exchange. Right? But there were. So, I mean, when we find these things, there are sources, and then again, like who narrates in what way? So I think it's really time that we start producing these things. That's alternative history.
There are two persons online who want to enter in the discussion.
Yes.
One is Akshay. and the other is Professor Kim. So Axel, you were first. It's Kim.
Yeah.
May I speak?
Okay. So
Okay. Oh, thank you so much for your lecture. It's a very huge. I say it's a very huge project and very challenging, and it gives me lots of things to think about. I think already this question was raised. For example, what is a philosophy? What is the definition of philosophy, etc., etc. So, forgive me if I already have missed your point you have already mentioned. But my question is, does your project also include the question how the concept or the definition of philosophy is accepted or interpreted in different societies or in different cultures? For example, it's a very, very ridiculous example. In Seoul, I'm Korean, I lived in Seoul, and about 20, 30 years ago, we can find many houses, and the name of the houses is the House of the Philosophy. Especially the northwest side of the Seoul city, you can find many lots of the houses of philosophy, but actually they are not. I cannot say. I don't know how can I explain, but that is the house of the fortune teller. So they are grounded on the shamanistic or Taoistic way of thinking, and they are the fortune teller. They, as a job, they do their fortune telling. But I imagine the reason they call themselves the House of Philosophy, that means they think their fortune telling has the reasonable and the analytical, a very reasonable foundation ground. So for them, the philosophy is a very exact and the very reasonable and very, how can I say, the philosophy is not a religion, not a real the belief. It has a real, they can find real foundational ground of our lives. So I think many people laugh at that phenomena, but I think it is their own interpretation of what philosophy is. So it's just merely one example. So my question is, does your project also include the various interpretation of the concept of philosophy in many societies or in many cultures, etc., etc.?
Yeah, we do actually, but we actually have not had a fortune telling as a category, but that's interesting. In oral traditions, conference that we had, some of those rituals goes in this direction, right? But that's actually a good point. In Korean and other traditions, they have this. I can't answer right away whether we would actually include it in our list or not. But maybe not. Yeah. Also similar. If you walk into an esoteric bookstore in the United States, under metaphysics, you find all kinds of books, right? Are they philosophy or are they? What do we do with them? So these are sort of good gray zone material. My guess would be they will not be included, but why? I can't really quite answer. Yeah. So, but fortune telling, yeah.
Okay, maybe I can mention in this way. The project also include the how the philosophy not only in the academic level but also in the popular level or the.
But they are probably very long tradition that's sort of rooted in the I Ching. So if so, there must be some philosophical background that is transmitted into these practices, right? So that I don't think you can simply dismiss that as non-philosophy.
Astrology and divination
are
very important in classical philosophy. They're not vanished from the scene. I'd like to do an advertisement. You mentioned the Greek and the origins of Greece, and this book, which was published by Nanzan, Questioning Greece by Maria Petit, is a critique.
That's good. Yeah.
It's a critique of Heidegger for ignoring the non-Greek origins of Greece, especially Egyptian origins, and the total dialogue between Greece and the surrounding older cultures of the region. And in contrast, she praises Simone Weil for, as she claims anyway, having a sensitivity towards that. I think it's an interesting topic for you.
Yeah, excellent. I don't want to read so much about Heidegger.
I think that Kim's question is really, really interesting. To return again, if shamanism or the divination in Korea is a fringe element to a much bigger tradition, a Confucian and perhaps Buddhist, but certainly tradition. And as a fringe element, you can't make it a pivot. But if you can define the pivot, then you can allow stuff in at the fringes. Like we do theosophy and esoteric bookstores and Gnosticism, even mysticism, because we have a pivot. But on their own, you'd say, well, I don't know whether I should include them or not. You have to put some histories don't make sense until they're put in the context of a bigger history, of which they are made. Like what just Joe was talking about Greek philosophy. If you see the bigger tradition, then a lot of fringe elements survive as part of it. So the definition of the discovery of those pivots is really important.
As we discussed in oral traditions, for instance, a lot of these oral traditions have this identification with nature. No? That's a moment for them. It's existential. It's absolutely philosophical in their understanding of personhood, not everything. So it's something similar. So if something in the environment changes, then you have been changed, right? So all these are deeply interesting and philosophical ideas, but it's not articulated as philosophy in the way that we know it. And divination is probably similar, so that's we actually don't have that as a subcategory.
But you included the I Ching, and that is all sorts of philosophical vocabulary.
That's right.
Draw on a tradition, they wouldn't exist. And the same thing with shamanism.
And I think what the three of you, King Sensei, Haidu Sensei, and Sensei are saying is the same, because if we don't take these into consideration, then we can throw away all the history of Christian philosophy, for example, right? And nobody would throw away, let's say, St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, or Augustinus, right? Just because they are religious or mystics in a way, you know? So the same needs to be done about these other traditions, right? Thank you.
Now I think it's the turn of Akshay. Waiting for a long time.
Sorry.
Akshay, please.
Thank you. I would like to go the point raised by Professor Leary, the book on questioning Greece. And this is a very German intention. It started with Kant, who said that all philosophy started from Greece and went to Protestant Europe. And this was later taken up by philologists and historians. And philologist is like Wolff, Friedrich A. Wolff, who's a founder of the discipline of philology, and Droysen, founder of discipline of history. Both of them wrote history in a way they excluded Jews, Hebrew Bible, and made it only like Greece, Rome, and later Protestant Europe, not even Catholic Europe. So the point I'm trying to tell is, after Holocaust, Germany is yet to reconcile with the Jews. They only integrated Jews back to economy, politics, media, and academia, not philosophically. The whole term Judeo-Christian or Judeo-Western civilization intentionally removes Jews and puts them in a hyphen marker. So this division affects this project. That is my point, actually. Unless Germany can reconcile with Jews the way it was before Holocaust or before 19th century, then Germany can do a much better project than it is doing now, which is like this project. That is my whole point. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thanks. Also, that's absolutely correct. So the German-speaking tradition, they are sort of Christian in orientation. So the Jewish tradition and Jewish history and Jewish thought, I had actually long been excluded. And that has influenced the making of the history of Western thought. And actually, that was true in French, Italian, and any of these major European languages that produced a history of philosophy. So that Jewish thought is also not so integrated in Arabic literature more, but not, so it might be a sort of category on its own to trace the diasporic history of Jewish thought. Anke Granis' book on Africa, I mean, it's a very old tradition that was in Africa. And so that is, I think, is a very interesting subfield, the history of Jewish philosophy. I mean, yeah, as we know, right? I mean, the Germans are very good at excluding Jewish thought. So not just thought. So it has its very dark history.
Are you being quite fair there? Because many of those Jewish philosophers in Germany were also mainstream philosophers. For example, Rosenzweig wrote a book on Hegel's philosophy of the state before he went on to the Star of Redemption, you know. And Hermann Cohen wrote Jewish books as well as commentaries on Kant. Mm-hmm. They couldn't be excluded. And Moses Mendelssohn and Spinoza, for example, also. Mm-hmm. You can't take philosophy and leave their Judaism aside because the two things are so closely connected. Mm-hmm. So I would say the story is richer than exclusion. It's not exclusion. It's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
By the way, German theologians, oddly enough, tend to be Marcionites. That is to say, they think we should get rid of the Old Testament. And a friend of mine created a huge scandal last 5 years ago when he said that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, should not be considered part of the Christian canon. Rather, it is the text of the religion that preceded Christianity. Now, the thing is, he was able to show that the three greatest German theologians agreed with him, namely Schleiermacher, Harnack, and Bultmann. They were all Marcionites. You know, there's a kind of an intrinsic tendency in German theology to be a Marcionite rejection of the Old Testament. I even see traces of it in the late Pope Ratzinger.
Mm-hmm.
Can I put a question?
Yes.
Yes. But the discussion is very interesting. But I'm a little bit confused. So your project is about history of philosophy, or is about what is philosophy? Because we started from history of philosophy,
right?
Then the question is, what is philosophy?
Right. Yeah.
So what is the goal of your research?
Well, yeah.
It's possible to think history of philosophy without to put the question, what is philosophy? Yes, in a certain sense, yes, if we are satisfied with just to make a list of book with in the title, the word history of. Mm-hmm. But maybe it's not enough, so we have to ask what is philosophy. But in my opinion, and this is my question, what about history?
Yeah, that too.
The relation between history and philosophy. So must philosophy have a history? And in which sense is philosophy historic? So what is the relation between philosophy or thought and time? Mm-hmm. So
these are also interesting questions. So as we started, I think we just sort of simply assumed that, well, if we looked at book titles that had the word philosophy in history in the book title in any language, we'll pick them, right? And then it became really complicated because we realized history itself is a post-19th century concept. So I thought, wait a minute, it's the historiography of. So we started to look at, okay, these people don't do history in the way we think a history is. So, I mean, so it just got very complicated. So historiography of the histories of philosophies, yeah? And that's the sort of the result of this kind of a research in different languages. And yeah, history is a strongly temporal term. as a result of the historiography making, which is a result of this post-18th century conception of time in these sequence of events, yeah, which was not shared by ancient Indian or Chinese or any of the other worlds, right? So we don't want to enforce our notion of history, but at the same time, again, it's a question of where do you draw the line, right? So that they had to somehow talk about the sequence of events, for instance, previous masters, or this master said this, and the disciple said this, and the disciple changed this idea to this, and so on. So some kind of a sequential development we kept as the notion of history, but not our sense of the centuries or time periods or any those things we didn't have. And so it's just a practical question of what kind of list can we actually reasonably have, right? So the decision making was, first of all, if it was clear they are talking about some kind of a history of philosophy, they were in. The next will be the history, some vague sense of philosophical topic or philosophical methodology or philosophical ways of dealing with the material. Okay, they are in. If they talked about only one person, they were not in. If it was not a historical analysis, then they were not in. And sometimes we have books on the history of political thought, and we look at it. It's Locke and Berkeley. Okay, then it's about the book about Locke and John Locke and Berkeley, so they are not in. So we don't really have a master list, but it's a judgment call. Many of the writing in aesthetics, what we would normally call aesthetics, religion, political thought, social philosophy. I mean, these are all sort of education, for instance, philosophy of education. These are sort of areas where, every week we had a meeting and we have a list of things we have to discuss. Or what about this? In, out, in, out. So that's tedious part.
You cannot give up the concept of history.
Yeah, so just because
we need to make the title history of philosophy.
Well, because that was our interest.
There is a relation between history and thought. So this is what I don't understand.
Yeah, that was like a particular interest of ours that we wanted to have a history of, right? So that a different project could be the global history. I mean, not global philosophy or something along those lines. But we were interested in how do in a particular language that's not necessarily Western, how do they talk about history, first of all? How do they talk about history of thought? How do they represent philosophy in a historical manner? So that was our particular interest, but it could be otherwise, I'm sure, yeah.
Again, to follow up on this question, it's got me thinking. I mean, history as a sequence of events or as a story, is one thing, and it's another thing if you, instead of the word history, use the word tradition.
Yeah.
Which is something that's passed down. And it doesn't mean that it's passed down, it improves from generation to generation. It doesn't mean that the ancients aren't as valid today as they were a long time ago. But it also means that there's someone receiving, receives obviously according to the biases and specifics of the age. But to speak of philosophical traditions rather than to speak of histories, because history has all this baggage on it.
Traditions, philosophical traditions, But that's probably, in terms of content, that's more accurate, I think,
But I would guess that to explain to the German funding society or something, it's easier to use history than traditions, right? That's my guess.
And interestingly, right, the German word for history is Geschichte, and Geschichte is also story. It's the same word.
That's what I was thinking when you were talking about that history is a group of stories or something, right? And in Portuguese or Spanish, we use the same word, right?
Yes,
We have no
right.
difference between
Right.
history and story in Portuguese or Spanish.
The same thing.
In
And
German.
the same
yeah.
in German, right? So
So it's like a narrative.
So historias.
Yeah, it's a narrative representation of events and traditions and yeah. Which we take it to be somehow natural and real, but it's actually a process of elimination and adaptation and narration making, right? So,
But again, if you use history, you can include objectively, the fascism and the
yeah,
half philosophy, the pseudo philosophies. If you use tradition always means including and excluding. The tradition continues by allowing for alternatives, but just defining itself. So it's a self-defining thing with the kind of vocabulary that goes on with it, and then maybe a methodology or whatever. But
So it's turning out that after our project, our project ends in March 2024. We have more ideas for a new project than when we started. So we just sort of innocently started this collection of bibliographies, and massive database is collected, and then we have all these questions. So that's where we're at.
it's amazing.
But it has been a really interesting project to be a part of. Yeah, I'm very glad that. Yes.
Can I ask more of a practical question?
Yes.
Theoretical question. You may have mentioned this at the beginning.
Yeah.
You don't use my face on
the microphone.
Okay, the mic. Okay. But how did you collect the data for the bibliography? Like, what was your methodology?
The World Cat. That is essential.
Yeah.
And for me, the National Library, what do you call this? Kokuritsu Toshokan database. That's very slow.
Yeah.
But
That's a long.
you click something and you have to wait like minutes before they load up things, and then so it's like hours of database work.
But I mean, the National Library database, it is online. So
it is online.
In Japan, that's
It is very good.
revolutionary.
And then for all of these languages, the native speakers of Indonesian have to go on to the Indonesian. So it is dependent on what kind of data is available.
Okay.
And I don't know if anybody actually went to the library in other languages. I don't know.
Because I was curious about that as well, because that also determines your history here of the information that is available. Because likely there's lots of material that's not available on online databases.
And also oral traditions, none of them is.
On places where, Japan is one example. The National Diet Library collects lots of material and makes it available online, but there are other libraries that aren't.
Movies and music
and
something.
The World Cat is again a sort of like they have collected everything. That's a huge, amazing list. But you do need to spend hours actually doing searches and cross searches on the cross searches to try to come up with a reasonable list of things. And then so the first couple of years it was just database collection.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
History is a very strong thing with the Greeks. You have Herodotus, Thucydides, and then with the Latins, thousands of historians, many of whom were suppressed for political reasons. But history of ideas, history of thought, it's also there because you have Diogenes, the lives of the great philosophers, and you have Porphyry, the philosophy of history, or history of philosophy, Philosophos Historia, I think is the title. And these tend to be chronicles, a long sequence of events, perhaps without a sense of historicity in the modern sense. I mean, it really is the Germans, again, the great Germans at the beginning of the 19th century, who get the sense of the historicity of thought in a very refined sense. It's not only Hegel, it's all the other people of that time. It's a whole boom. And today, perhaps we're asking, is there such a thing as history at all? Is history just a Western myth? When we use the phrase history of philosophy, we have a double whammy. We have a Western concept of history and a Western concept of philosophy. And perhaps it's not. The very basic concepts need to be shaken.
Yeah. That's yeah. Result of our research is that both concepts are suspect somehow, that in need of great deconstruction. That's true. Yeah. The historiographies of but somehow in every just about in every language there is some notion of historicity. So it is a. I mean, there have not been a material that people didn't understand that concept. So we do organize events in before and after, and no. So that is some. Yeah, some things.
And also in terms of a national myth, like the Romans had a myth of Rome. And that's, they had a historicity in a philosophical sense underlying their chronicles.
And it is a sort of a construction that just about every nation, the whole notion of nation depends on this construction, right? Japan is also.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in this construction also belongs to, this construction is the history of thought and philosophy, its own, which makes it the country that it is, that you want to represent. Another difficulty we have is that's one of the reasons we didn't want to do national histories, but languages. Yeah. Because out of the languages came the national borders. Spanish, for instance. Now, Spanish is a language. The Spanish has, from all our languages, the most national philosophies produced. Just about every nation in South America has a national history of its own. The philosophy, the philosophy of Paraguay, philosophy of Ecuador, philosophy of Peru, and then this all. Yeah, it's part of the nation making to have a history of philosophy of its own. In the sense that in a German language, they just do philosophy in German. And then there's some Austrian history of philosophy, but very few. And then Japanese is somehow linguistic border and a national border is identical. So that's not, so I mean.
But you're also right to choose the languages rather than the histories, because, for example, the history of philosophy in Indonesia is written by a Dutchman.
Things like that.
It's like an anthropological study.
Right,
But that's not Indonesian philosophy.
Right,
according to his standards. And that's perhaps how the word philosophy made it all over the identities of South America in the modern period.
Yeah, it's so colonial.
They'd already taught them, the missionaries, that you needed to have a philosophy to be a respectable nation.
And then to be able to talk about ideas at all, right? So that's why to look at the languages is a whole different methodology as thinking in regions or nations. And there was a specific interest in language than nations.
I think concerning the South or the Latin American countries, all those countries, when you see during their process of independence, you see these kinds of source books on Brazilian thought or Argentinian thought, like showing up because they are in this process of building a nation or a national identity.
That's also part of the history. And some of them are extremely nationalistic, right?
Especially during those times.
So it's politically also very interesting to look at the formation of national philosophies.
I have a related question. In the last part of your presentation, you used a quotation from Rolf Eberfeld that probably is representative of your group way of thinking, and it was that if political power does not stop this process in 2100 would be complete. So in which sense do you think that political power has interest in history of philosophy or in stopping this kind of movement? So and my impression is that nowadays political power doesn't care in any way about philosophy or philosophy. So it makes really no difference if in Italy we have a new history of philosophy or not. I think not in my opinion, but I guess in the opinion of the contemporary Italian politicians. So what could be these how can I say?
Political interventions?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what do you mean concretely?
Maybe in some Latin American countries, or that could be, the political interventions could be contentious, or I'm not sure.
I think that the philosophy can be expropriated to a certain extent by finances, by economics, by politics. But I think the most dangerous one is the expropriation of philosophy by morality. That morality becomes the center of philosophy and moral policing. And you police your own philosophical thought based upon a certain moral agenda you have. I think that's the most dangerous thing.
And in Brazil, it's huge. For example, during the Bolsonaro government, we have Paulo Freire, for example. He's considered the patron of Brazilian education, right? He has like a place in like what's it called, like the pantheon of the heroes of the fatherland or something. And the Bolsonaro government actually actively tried to take his name out of the pantheon and to put another guys who just died 2 years ago. He died of corona, of a disease that he was saying that didn't exist, you know. And he's a Brazilian neo-fascist philosopher, you know. That's what I was talking about, the bad philosophies. So we see this happening. And there's that other guy in Russia, what's his name? The guy with the beard that they call
Yes, but my question is not related to some philosopher who are thinking today, but in relation with the history of philosophy. So I don't think that Trump cares if we think that the history of philosophy is eurocentric or we have to include other cultures. So the question, the relation is the history of philosophy will change, not philosophy, the history of philosophy. So in which sense? Because
of the narration of the history of philosophy might become very different, right?
Yes.
I think so.
And it will necessarily probably going to be very diverse. So I don't think we can.
Yes, but for example, nowadays Germany, you are doing this research in Germany. Does the German government stop your project?
It's actually the opposite.
So and then so what is this kind of ingerence of
so I mean, like historiography is changing, right?
Political, not in the institutional sense, but political in the academic politics sense, or exclusion of women. For instance, women want to try to do telling of the history of thought, but maybe they'll be barred from doing so in some countries. So that the Iranian history of philosophy will look very exclusionary, for instance. I mean,
but like in academia, German academia, you can't write philosophy anymore as if it's simply a Western thing, right? The academic pressure would be too great. You can't write philosophy as if women don't think.
United States,
at least token. You have to. So it's changed. Where is it going to change ahead? I mean, that's
but you know, Jim, this is not. This is. I talked about 10 years ago to Andreas Arndt, who is a great Hegelian and a great Marxist, and he told me that if you have a doctorate on Hegel, you will not get a job in philosophy departments in Germany.
So I see the political landscape influencing a lot of these. If it doesn't, I agree with what Professor.
Can I ask one more question in all this? In this histories of philosophy that are beginning to, that you found in all these different languages, and they're beginning to spread out beyond Western philosophy, what's the position of analytical philosophy?
That's a good one, because they are ahistorical.
Yes.
They are like an extremely sort of ahistorical subset of semantic philosophy. And it's a part of post 19th century analytic tradition, right? It is a tradition, yeah. And it's sort of taken over the United States and nowadays Europe too, yeah. So it's spread beyond the sort of Anglo-Saxon worlds. And it is sort of like, favorite methodological approach to philosophy, at least in the United States. Yeah, but I think they will always stay. I mean, but as a sort of a.
But in the other language groups, that doesn't figure. Histories of.
But you know,
philosophy it's there as a part of representation of European and American philosophy. Yeah.
But listen, there is already a very good tradition of analytical philosophy that tries to engage with Indian thinking.
Right.
Himself, and so-called fusion philosophy of Mark Sideritz and Jan Westerhoff,
Chakrabarti and
they take up Western philosophical discussions about logic and so on, the kind of thing that Bertrand Russell would talk about, and they find the same topics or similar topics discussed by Indian logicians, and they set up a fusion philosophy where the issues are discussed with equal input from those Indian and Western sources, and that's a very promising thing because it's a solid bridge. You know, it's not just vague homologies.
Yeah, that's the only example that I know of is the Indian epistemology. Yeah, it's extremely analytic, and maybe early Buddhist epistemologies as well. But those are sort of the only. I'm not sure. I mean, if you do moral philosophy or ethics, you can find connections all over everywhere, right? So, but this particular analytic epistemological discussions is Indian and Buddhist, but not in Taoist or Confucian or any of the other tradition. I don't know. Maybe Egyptian philosophy. I don't know what's going on there in Egyptian philosophy. Maybe they are just as complicated and sort of metaphysical. I'm not sure. Yeah. So,
can I put on the last question?
Yeah, last question. Yeah.
Because Professor ARISAKA, you are Japanese, so there is a question that I want to put. So probably, tell me if I'm wrong, the most commonly used the history of philosophy in Japan is the Tetsugaku no Rekishi, series of orange books that extend from Old Greek, from very orthodoxly to contemporary philosophy, and that excludes completely the Japanese.
Yeah, of course.
So why? So there is a philosophical reason, psychoanalytical reason. So I don't know.
Reason,
Why?
Well, post 1940.
I was just saying, Paul Deussen, in his famous Allgemeine Geschichte der Philosophie, has a discussion of Japanese thinkers. This is around the year 1900.
No, but the question is why the history of philosophy written by Japanese in Japan excludes the contemporary Japanese philosophy. I understand if they exclude Dogen, but they exclude completely the 20th century philosophy from the book. So what could be the reason?
Post 1945, Japanese philosophy was banned. So philosophy became completely Eurocentric. This is a standard line, right? So, but until 1945, it was not. So Japan was the cutting point was 1945.
And there's an irony in when you were here in 2004, and we had a discussion of Japanese philosophy abroad in various languages, language groups. At the same time, the Nihon Tetsugakai was meeting at Nanzan University. And I happened to meet with the editor of Tetsugaku Kenkyu and told him what we were doing. And he said, would you write an essay on Japanese philosophy for Tetsugaku Kenkyu? And I said, well, what kind of Japanese philosophy do you treat? He said, we don't. Right? So I wrote an essay on Tanabe, which they published, the first one. So,
And since 1996, it's again possible to do Japanese philosophy in Japan.
But also, Enrico, sorry, I think this idea of because maybe as another person who is not from an European country or an American or from the global South. Right? So actually in Brazil, most books you would buy on history and philosophy, I don't think any of them would include any South American or African or Japanese philosopher, even Brazilian, because it's European. It's a philosophy, it's a European thing. Even very often you wouldn't even see American philosophers included in the book. The first time I studied, let's say, William James was after coming to Japan. Yeah, because in Brazil, like you're talking about analytic philosophy, right? In Brazil, it's non-existent, basically. We study Kant, we studied European philosophy.
The thing is, you feel that you are completely excluded from philosophy because you are Brazilian, so you cannot take part in the discussion.
This, I feel this changing in the last 10 years or so, maybe, because we have Amanda's group. Carlos is there as well, right? From Alafi. Right, from the Latin American philosophy and intercultural philosophy, but that's a very, very recent thing. And by recent, I mean like the past 10 years or so.
But look at who was in charge of philosophy in South America with the seminaries.
And
the seminary teachers went to the universities. And this was philosophia perennis. That's what you taught. Philosophy that fed into theology. So there was no room for William James.
This Deussen reference, could you send me this Deussen reference? Is Allgemeine Geschichte der Philosophie that you mentioned?
And there's also this colonial mind as well, right?
Whether we have that or not.
Of seeing the world through their eyes, not this.
But this is not the same thing as Japan.
No, it's a different phenomenon.
Very Japanese specificity.
But when you see what happened after 1945, like she was saying, right? You have Suzuki going abroad to show Japan.
Did you get the question, Joe?
Countries, right? And then you have Nishitani being basically canceled.
Yes, but
the Deussen book, do you have any details on it?
I didn't mention that, but the historian, and apparently the book is called Hellenic Greeks and Jews. Wait a second now. I'm looking it up on the internet here. But I think it's this whole thing about the Hellenic and Athens and Jerusalem. It's a kind of a standard topic in the 19th century in Germany.
No, I'm sorry. That is not. It is not that.
No. This Hellenism. No.
No. It is a paper on how the whole discipline of Hellenism got constructed.
Great, and all these historians out there.
It is not
I found Allgemeine Geschichte mit besonderer Berücksichtigung der Religion im Buch von Paul Deussen. Okay, I found it. 1788. Okay. That's good.
1788 is...
Yeah, 1788 is good. I have to check whether we have this reference or not.
So I think
it's good. Thank you very much for the reference.
Before to finish, I see that from HK there is a request to Professor ARISAKA. Could you type the name of analytical and Indian?
Analytical Indian material. Well, if you look at Mark Sideret, Arindam Chakrabarti.
Matilal,
yeah, and well, if somebody is faster at typing, right?
You surely find something in Wilhelm Halbfass. He wrote several books on India and Europe. Halbfass,
but if you do Indian epistemology, you will find a huge literature. There's that, So this is Attila, the Matila. It can be Matila. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So Professor, thank you
very much. Thank you very much.
Very interesting
It's pretty interesting.
talk, and I hope we can continue another this kind of discussion.
Yes, it will be. Yeah.
So thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Hey.